Welcome back to the Ascension Facilitated Sessions where medicine, mentorship, and mastery unites. I am Dr. Darren Jackson, your co-host and moderator. I'm joined here by my co-host and expert facilitator, Dr. David Leon Taylor.
Welcome back to our future doctors to FS.
Yes, sir. So today we are going to pull back the curtains on one of the more nerve-wracking experiences in that application cycle. And it's, towards the end because, you're closing things out.
Yes.
And so it's a satisfying experience, but also very nerve-wracking because a lot is at stake, right? So just thinking about the medical school interview. So that is today's facilitated session is Action, the med school interview, right?
It's showtime.
Showtime. So it is definitely showtime. It is, as you would say, definitely time to get down.
Oh,
right?
yes.
So,
TTGD.
yes. So we're going to, but before we start, as someone who has been in the admissions committee and advisory committee, space for so many years, what's a memorable moment that you can reflect back on from an interview?
One of my favorite stories after 35 years, of course, in medical school admissions and having the opportunity to interview hundreds of future doctors such as yourselves. I remember this, of course, was an in-person interview.
Mm-hmm.
The scholar showed up with his entire family. And I was like, this is going to be interesting because this is what we refer to as a traditional interview or a one-on-one interview. But we had the parents, an aunt, and two younger siblings, and they all came and introduced themselves. And I was like, well, welcome. This is absolutely wonderful. And I'm so happy to be interviewing your scholar today. But afterwards, we can do a family interview and I can learn more about everyone. And everyone, of course, had a great laugh. But in essence, it's great to have moral support, but we're going to need to come as an individual scholar for medicine, right? And have to leave our outstanding family or other supporters in a special area of the medical school, etc.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you shared that because it could have went a different way with somebody else,
Yes.
And so I think understanding a strategy and first of all, just understanding what the medical school interview encompasses, how to prepare, the mind frame that you should, take into that interview is something that we will develop in today's facilitated sessions as frameworks, right?
Yes.
So let's get into a couple of frameworks. So I want to start with the first, which is the actual interview, because there are different types of interviews, correct? And I just want you to give a little bit of that information to our future doctors about the type of interview that they can encounter on medical school interview day.
So let's start with the most common interview, which is what we call the traditional interview or the one-on-one interview. And DJ, I know you've had experience with this, which is we could be in a room together. I'm the interviewer, you are the outstanding candidate, and we're going to have a one-on-one conversation for the first 45 minutes up to an hour. You remember those days?
I do. So that was, and I have an interesting experience around interviews because my medical school interview was traditional and in person. My residency interviews were virtual, and that adds a whole different context to it. And so I got to see that transition because I believe I might have been the first year or the second year of those virtual interviews.
Yes.
And so it was a lot of chatter around that we'll get into a little bit later in today's facilitated session. But yeah, that's what I was used to, that in-person, in the room, traditional type of interview.
So our second one is the multiple mini interview. And the multiple mini interview sounds like I'm having a lot of interviews.
Right.
And in essence, you are, but they're very structured. I want you to imagine having 5 separate rooms. There will be an outstanding interviewer in that room, such as yourself. The difference from the traditional one is that there is only one question that you'll be asked to respond to in each of those 5 rooms. and it actually is presented as a small case or scenario, and it's designed to have you think around different areas of your professional development or ethics, and we'll talk more about that. But it's very distinct from the traditional interview, obviously, which is one-on-one, and that interviewer is asking you a series of questions over a course of an hour. The MMI, or multiple minute interview, it's shorter, 8 minutes per station or interview room.
So yeah, I have had experience with the MMIs from a virtual context, and yes, so it's you do get these very intentional vignettes, and part of that process is being able to navigate in the moment what curveballs you may be getting, but then also being so familiar with yourself, your portfolio, your alignment, because basically you want to translate an authentic presentation to the interviewer. So, but you get these various different opportunities within this one day of interviewing, the MMI, to respond to unique scenarios, but also you have to figure out a way to align your profile as the student, as the interviewee, into that interview.
And then the last type of interview is what we call the panel interview. And that's a very interesting one. A lot of schools are still using it now. Instead of different stations with the MMI, one person per room in a scenario, or a one-on-one, we have a group. And in this group, it could be up to 5 people. Sometimes we have faculty, medical students, and maybe a third individual that represents a different group. It could even be a community member. But they're each bringing different perspectives of assessing and inviting you to discuss your journey to medicine. And so now you're in the room, again, for up to 60 minutes. Multiple individuals are going to ask you questions, taking turns, but they're bringing different perspectives. And so the preparation, DJ, for these 3 different types of interviews has some similarity, but also some very unique differences.
So that was a good overview of the different types of interviews that many of our future doctors will encounter on interview day. So with that being said, how does the student get into that right framework of how to navigate those different scenarios? You have an MMI, you have a panel, you have a traditional interview. What is a particular technique? What is the techniques that a student should adapt going into these various types of interviews? So there's this one technique that maybe many of our future doctors have heard about, which is called the STAR technique. Situational, talking, action, and results. Then we also have this reflective technique that, has been discussed in the ways in which student doctors can go into this medical school interview. What are your reflections on how those 2 techniques interplay for our particular learners?
Well, let's start with the second one, which is reflection. Reflection always refers back to thinking about your own journey, thinking about your professional experiences, your personal life experiences, your educational journey. All of those experiences now tie into the STAR approach, because you may be given a situation in the MMI. That's one of the scenarios. It could be a situation. Well, reflect on the situation that happened in your life. You may be asked to consider a particular task, maybe as part of a panel, a traditional interview, or even in an MMI, as a way to have you share how would you go about accomplishing a task that would be meaningful for patient care. And that may be based on some of your professional and personal experiences from your clinical shadowing or from some other volunteer experience. You see how it ties in?
It does tie in.
And so the other 2 aspects of the STAR apply the same way as we reflect and engage in the interview process. So the goal is, we talk about authenticity. The authenticity is truly bringing in your journey. And we talked about this in earlier FS sessions, right?
That alignment.
We talked about how in our early facilitated sessions, knowing who we want to become, and as we go along that journey, continuing to consider what we've accomplished, where we're growing, and how that relates to what I want to become. Mm-hmm. That's what's happening in an interview. It's actually a conversation.
Yeah. And a very important conversation, because it gives the university, the admissions committee, insight to you, insight to your authenticity, to see how your alignment on paper matches what you're saying on the day of the interview. So
absolutely,
very, very important. So let's get into the third framework, where we're talking about emotional intelligence. Now, that conversation can incorporate a lot of things, but we want to look at it from the lens of the interview. So I know when I think about emotional intelligence, mm-hmm. From a mental health standpoint, it is that understanding of who you are, and being able to be aware of the emotional experiences that you are taking on, being able to identify that emotion, labeling it, being able to understand where that emotion may be coming from, a traumatic incident, whatever the case may be. But then the key piece is building a system to regulate those emotions. And like I always say, the emotion is not the bad thing. I think we all oftentimes link anger with a bad feeling, a bad emotion, or fear with bad feelings. But these are just human experiences. It's a human emotion. But in the context of the regulation, understanding how to regulate those emotions is what's key in emotional intelligence. So how does that translate with the interview? Because I heard you talk about these techniques with the STAR and the MMI, and how you can get these different curveballs while you're real time, and you're expected to respond to these different situations in real time. How does emotional intelligence play a role in the interview process?
It starts with authenticity again. So a lot of interviewing is in understanding who you are. You do not have to pretend. And I want to caution future doctors, as you consider your interview preparation with a mentor, which is very important, be sure to understand, again, what's been your journey. Keep your journey in terms of its authenticity of where you've been successful, where you're growing, where you need to take accountability. Why is this important? Because emotionally, we may ask you, how will you engage a situation where you have to share some unfortunate news with a family regarding a loved one? So certainly empathy and compassion come in that domain, right? But part of that also comes with, have you been honest with yourself in how you share important information, how you take accountability? Because that same skill now is going to be happening when you're working with your patients. So it's a behavior that's embedded in the emotion. How do you deal with unfortunate situations that have happened along your educational journey or your personal journey? Yes, you may have had some disappointment, maybe even anger. Sometimes you've had sadness. So how have we been dealing with those emotions as part of our own wellness? Because when you're in healthcare and we give you a situation in healthcare in one of these interviews, a patient may not survive a particular medical intervention. That's of no fault to you. It's just simply because everything was reasonably done, but unfortunately, that patient was called home, right, to the Lord. And so at that point, you may experience some sadness. You've experienced sadness in other areas of your life. You may even experience some disappointment because in medicine, you always felt you could help someone. Mm-hmm. So now how do you deal with that emotion now? So we are assessing in the interview, how do you respond to those type of scenarios? But they're not robotic. They actually link, as you said, to earlier experiences in your own life. And so it ties into the earlier facilitated session where you talked about, DJ, how are we focusing on our wellness? How are we reflecting on it? Because at times you're going to be asked about experiences that intersect with your professional journey. We're going to talk about that in the interview. So authenticity in how you've been dealing with that is what we're seeking.
And I think it's important to highlight how kind of low key that assessment is, because it's like woven and embedded.
Yes.
You're not even realizing that your communication about your emotional intelligence with self is an indication to the assessor of how that will translate to your professionalism. And
That's
I
correct.
think that also will mirror within your personal statement, your extracurriculars, your professional experiences that we talked about in previous facilitated sessions, because it goes to that authenticity. If everything is pretty much aligned and it is truly anchored to you, then you really don't have a problem translating that in the interview. And if there are certain areas where, like you said, mentorship comes into play, where we might need to fine tune this aspect of your interviewing style, this aspect, and just, customize it for the type of interview that you will actually have, I think is important. But understanding how almost low key certain aspects of what the AdCom is assessing and how they're assessing it. You writing in your personal statement about how you handled a particular tragedy in your life is also an indication to the admissions committee about how you will manage stress as a professional, as a doctor, but then also how you would manage the disappointment and stressful situations that you encounter as the doctor, with unfortunate news, patients dying. Those are things that all pulls at our heartstrings. So that's a very important thing that I think our future doctors should hear.
And it all ties together, DJ. You just brought it all home, because again, that's part of the journey of who you're becoming. Mm-hmm. And a key piece, I just want to underscore what you said again, one more time. So everyone, I want you to make sure you hear that. When this has been your journey and your process, as you said, it translates because it's who you are. If you are doing too much rehearsal, too much practicing around what have been my experiences, etc., it means you haven't been reflecting along the way. You haven't been reflecting along the way of who you're becoming. So it's not natural for you to talk about that. The practice with a mentor is to give you a chance to share. And as you said, the key pieces of your sharing are going to come across authentic. And we just might say, but didn't you also have this experience? Oh, that's right. And then you'll start talking about it. Or we might say, be sure to maintain eye contact. Be sure, of course, to have good posture. Those other soft skills.
Right.
But the key, as you said, is going to come through the scholar.
Yes. I think we can jump into our next framework, which is something that I know my future doctors out there is going to enjoy. It is the dreaded what question to ask the interviewer, right? So we've all been there where during an interview process, it's coming to an end or it's at an end of a block and you get that question, well, do we have any questions from the audience? And as the student, part of your showcase, your showmanship here in this moment is coming off a little smart, so you are racking your brain or you already have a question prepared that showcases your preparedness for the interview, that you've researched the school, that you've looked at this endowment and grant and, research, things that the university has gotten, that you found a way to align with your story. But what is your recommendations on approaching that point in the interview when the student is asked, what question do you have for us?
I'm going to start with, why I love FS so much, facilitated sessions?
Why?
Because we get the important information for mastery, Darren. Mm-hmm. The mentorship is so important for mastery. When we started out in our earlier FS, we talked about knowing who you're becoming, your professional identity. Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking about that particular medical school and you're interviewing and you really want to go to this school, we've talked about how you would have already reflected on your own personal goals, professional goals for where you want to practice medicine, how you want to practice, and you've been aligning that with the school. Right? So yes, you've done your research. The real question becomes, do you actually have a new point of inquiry or interest? We do not want to ask questions with information is already on the website. We're not trying to ask questions to which we already know the answer so we can seem informed. We see through that in AdCom, the admissions committee. We see through that.
So that doesn't come off.
No, it doesn't.
In our favor as a student.
No, it doesn't. What we're actually seeking, if you ask that question, is it is a unique situation where you set up, these are my specific goals, and I've actually, Dr. Jackson, looked very closely at all elements of this wonderful medical school. The curriculum, how you help me with my doctoring skills, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in this particular area, though, I'm looking for clarity because I really want to blend public health with patient care, but I didn't see a lot about the social determinants of health, et cetera. Maybe that's the case. I may have missed it, but could you clarify that type of opportunity?
Right.
And that question, we would also know from your professional experiences, we've seen a public health strand in your professional experiences. That question may also be anchored to something we saw in one of your recommendations. Mm-hmm. So we know it's authentic. The other side of it may be, I could also say, these are my goals. I've looked at everything for the school. And quite honestly, we've had such an informative conversation. I have all my questions answered.
So you don't have to ask a question.
And you can say it with authenticity, but remember, it's anchored in you sharing, you're wrapping up. Do you have any questions for me? My goals have really been to focus on public health and community-based medicine. I spent a lot of time, Dr. Jackson, because I really like this medical school, looking at all elements to support that. The curriculum, the professional experiences, the research opportunities. I've been very well informed. And quite frankly, in our discussion, I've gained even more information. I have no additional questions, but I appreciate the opportunity to interview with you today. Yeah. That's authentic.
Yeah, and I think I have said this many times, but this is a very important piece, because even into the residency or fellowship interview phase, you feel that pressure to ask a question, because just in general, and this goes outside of the context of medicine, just in general, you've been told during an interview, you ask a question. Now, my rule of thumb has always been to link the question with something that aligns with my background that it's not already been answered. So if I see, like you said, my background is in public health, this particular program has these aspects that tie into public health, but maybe I have a more specialized interest over here, where, then you kind of craft a question around tying those pieces in. But I think it's very important to also take the stress off of your back by, you don't have to ask a question. Knowing that you don't have to ask a question going into the interview is something that I think the students need to know, because if you truly don't have one, don't make an opportunity when there doesn't need to be an opportunity to be made.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the key piece is this. And a lot of times we may repeat ourselves because context is important. When we heard Dr. Jackson say, it's good for us to know going into an interview, we do not have to ask a question. Now, here's the qualifier. We don't have to ask a question if we have looked at our goals, reflected, done our in-depth research of the school,
Right.
and also during the interview, nothing else has come up. We're not saying, oh, wow, I'm so stressed about the interview. That's one less thing I have to worry about.
Yeah.
So I won't do anything else. I just won't ask any questions.
Yeah. No.
That's not good accountability,
Yes.
is it?
It is knowing you don't have to ask a question and make an opportunity. Like you said, if everything has been answered throughout the day of the interview, if you have put your due diligence in and your preparation into researching and making those alignments, and if the question has been asked, you know you don't have to search for an opportunity for a question.
Yes.
But if you do have one, make that opportunity.
Absolutely.
But if it's not there, then don't make it, because it can come off inauthentic.
Correct.
And that is in some ways, you know, Achilles heel for somebody in an interview, because the first whiff of a lack of authenticity from the applicant can be detrimental for the remainder of the day of interviews. And typically the interview will go for a few hours. So you want to put your best foot forward very early on. Let's get into, as we close out this final facilitated session on the interview, you know, because it's showtime. So all of our facilitated sessions was leading up to this time trajectory of now we're at the interview. What are some red flags that students should be aware of going into interview day? Because it's very important. Sometimes, you know the saying, if you don't know, you don't know. So a student may very well go into an interview doing exactly what they think is appropriate, but it may not be from the interviewer's standpoint. What are some red flags that you can give to our student doctors on what to think about going into the interview?
The first red flag is not taking accountability if there's an area of improvement in your application. And again, we'll look at this in a one-on-one setting. It's customized, but lack of accountability may be, you know, that you had to take the MCAT 3 times. And it may not be that the interviewer says, oh, I see that you've taken the MCAT 3 times. The interviewer may ask, open-ended, as you said, knowing yourself, have you ever experienced any challenges along your journey to medicine? The question becomes, will I share, and there's a way to share it, how, yes, the medical college admissions test was one of those challenges because I lacked the appropriate advising and mentorship to effectively develop a well-rounded strategy.
Language.
Right? As I engaged that valuable resource, I was able to appropriately learn the strategy and science of thinking. I learned that the exam was really about thinking, problem solving for what I'll be doing as a future physician. And as a result, my score improved. But here's the take-home point, Dr. Jackson. I'm in an interview with you. So I'm having a conversation. This comes across authentic. So here's the take-home point, Dr. Jackson. I recognize that there are going to be times where there's going to be continuing accountability for the learning. And the goal is not to move away, but to lean into what assistance do I need, because ultimately it's going to help me be a more appropriate learner, a better thinker, because I need to be prepared to help solve the concerns of my future patient.
So take that same response and give us a red flag response, because you gave us the customized DT response. What is an example of that response that can go left with a student who may not have gotten that expert DT advising on how to word that language.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the student may be thinking, which is a good first step, you may be thinking, this is probably time to talk about my MCAT. So here's what the student might say. Yeah, the MCAT was a challenge for me. I did better because I figured out that I need to practice more questions to get a better score.
Mm.
Now that response on the surface sounds, okay, I did some work to get a better score. And the interviewer will do this with you. And nod affirmatively. So you think you hit it out of the box. But in the interviewer's mindset, he or she is thinking, that's good, but I didn't hear about what was the accountability for how I had to adapt my learning. I didn't actually hear a connection to, it's important for me to assure I'm working on my critical thinking, and I connect it to patient care. I'm not just connecting it to a score. The future doctor, you're more than a grade, you're more than a score. Even though grades and scores, as we said, seem to loom over, remember we talked about that one of the earlier facilitated sessions? They actually are part of our ultimate growing identity about how I'm becoming a master learner so I can solve problems for my patient.
So accountability is a part of the process. But here's another one of those reoccurring themes that we keep touching on. Now, what is the first step to accountability?
Recognizing that you have something to be accountable for.
Reflection, right?
There it is.
So if you are not in the practice of being reflective, then this is another way in which this is what you're saying, essentially, that the interviewer is assessing if the applicant can exercise that, because a part of being a professional is having time to reflect on where you went wrong, on your strategy, how did you navigate that, particular situation, refine your strategy in order to become successful. So if your response is abbreviated to, I did bad, I went back to the drawing board and then did better, it doesn't give the person on the admissions committee the insight into your problem solving skills.
Yes.
And you've said many times across multiple facilitated sessions that the admissions committee is assessing your problem solving skills because that is a very key aspect of professionalism in medicine and you being a doctor. So be reflective, practice that. It also builds with the mental health stuff. So if you are journaling and being reflective on your day, where you are along your journey in medicine, how your emotions is driven towards that, your professional identity, and consistently going back, and we have one of our free web tools that you can download. But if you're consistently going back on that reflective piece along your journey, you're already getting into that practice. And so you're kind of already geared up to take accountability. And then that then benefits you in the interview process because you're taking this opportunity that, although open-ended question, you know that this is your time to talk about that red flag.
Exactly right.
Right.
That's exactly right.
You gotta say it. You gotta talk about it. But that language, the verbiage around how you talk about it is very, very vital because it does encounter that reflective piece, that emotional intelligence piece, that problem-solving piece. It really covers many of the things that we talked about in facilitated sessions.
And you know what else is interesting, DJ? One other important red flag that many times future doctors believe, wow, I may not be considered for medical school admission, is if you had an institutional action. So part of what we work on in the customization or one-on-one mentorship is how do you frame, through reflection, the accountability of the institutional action, whether it was academic or non-academic, on your primary application. And if you're now in the interview, showtime, and you had an institutional action and you were still given an interview, part of that was because of how you framed it on your application in accountability and reflection. But now the interviewer also wants to know whether it's real. Whether it's real. Did you actually write it, Darren? Or did DT write it? Right? And so what you shared a moment ago in terms of this ongoing practice can help with a lot of red flags as we close now to our final consideration for interviews.
So that was our final.
Oh.
FS is over. So I think to sum up today, it's important to know that your story is real and it becomes real in that interview. And as a student, you want to make sure it resonates. So having that language and that approach, that strategy going in, how you discuss, how you present your alignment throughout everything that you've done is a very important aspect, and it covers everything over the past facilitated sessions. It kind of brings it in. That's why this is a great stopping point for this series of our facilitated sessions. So again, we want our student doctors to take advantage of the free downloads that we have at our website. So DT, I'm really excited about our next series. I feel like we covered a lot, but I think that there's so much more to uncover. And so I want the student doctors to stay tuned for what's coming up next.
That's right. We're going to hold you in a little bit of excitement for the next series of facilitated sessions. Stay tuned. Of course, follow us on social media so you can get the announcement when we drop the next series of facilitated sessions.
See you soon.